Okay, so let's get started so we have as much time as possible for questions and discussion. So today for our colloquium we have Shelley Feldman, who has had an incredibly illustrious career, as you all well know. She is the president of the American Institute of Bangladesh Studies, the director of Feminist, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, and professor of development sociology at Cornell University. So today her talk is titled Constructing States and Citizens, Partition as a Social Project. And here she's going to be rethinking popular understandings of partition through an exploration of a variety of ways in which states unfold as social projects. So she's going to be looking at things such as regulation and attending to the practices that constitute the making of things like home and belonging, borders and boundaries, things that we're all interested in this room. So it should be an excellent opportunity for discussion. As you might guess, her resume could serve as a paperweight, pretty much. She's got, a myriad of, honors, research grants, and activities. I just want to call your attention to just a few. One is very recently, the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences awarded her a faculty award for science and public policy. In addition, I wanted to call attention to a colloquium that you had organized along with some other folks through the Society for Humanities. And it was titled Accumulating Insecurity, Securing Accumulation, a colloquium on militarization of everyday life. And this was done with Geisler and Manon. And this actually led to the book that is recently published in 2011, titled Accumulating Insecurity, Violence, and Dispossession in the Making of Everyday Life. I started reading it, and the introduction is fascinating. It begins with this really great meditation on Arendt and the ways in which we need to look not only towards exceptional violence, but also everyday violence. So it's really, really well done. And in addition, she has just a variety of fabulous articles about shame and honor, households and labor and global capitalism, intersecting and contesting positions in post-colonial feminism. So we have a lot to talk about. I'm not going to waste any more time with a longer introduction. If we could give a warm welcome, please, to Shelley.
Thanks, Chris. I appreciated that very generous introduction. Can I invite some of you to come closer? I mean, it seems like I'm going to have to scream much louder, and I really want it to be very informal. I mean, it just seems to me it would facilitate me getting a sense of where your eyes are and if I'm capturing your attention or not, and maybe increase your likelihood of engaging. Let me say that all of these projects, even though some of them focus on agriculture and agrarian change and some of them focus on households, I see through the lens of South Asia, Bangladesh in particular, but also South Asia. And so Bangladesh is a very, very much a part of how I see and experience the world, and I know that very few programs have people who work on Bangladesh. So it's an opportunity for me to sort of promote that window. But let me say that I probably will disappoint some of you if you want a lot of detail about Bangladesh. What I am going to try to do today is share with you a sense of the place of how Bangladesh is often envisioned, but also that it can be a case from which one can learn. In other words, taking it out of the victim space and putting it in the provocateur space, a way to actually see this country as having experiences or establishing ideas and frameworks and understandings that may serve others, as well as some of us who feel like compelled to read everything that comes out of Delhi and everything that comes out of Calcutta, because those are the centers of intellectual work, and we leave the rest of the world. And we're expected, by the way, as South Asian scholars, to know those debates, but very few people actually think with the lens of debates that happen elsewhere. And I surmise it's a little similar, but also very, very different than Pakistan experience or Nepal experience or Sri Lanka experience. But nonetheless, it's really important to see the peripheral countries as spaces which are also centers, as it were, of ways of looking at the world. the beginning, I'll start off with making some claims about an approach that I think is really critical. I'll make a distinction between nation formation and state formation, and what the importance of making that distinction is and how they work together. I'll share with you a case from the 1950s that will give you a window on what I think I'm trying to say with the case, and I would invite you to be as critical and engaged as you wish, to push me into directions that I perhaps haven't thought about, or think about things that I have thought about and you disagree with. So I think it might be an opportune time to have a really provocative discussion. I'll try to read, but I tend to sort of get off of reading very quickly. In analyses of South Asia, the 1947 partition features as a defining moment, a fundamental event, or a watershed. Das defines such critical events as those which redefine the categories and meanings we think with, and the new collectivities and forms of political action that emerge in its wake. There is little disagreement about the foundational character of partition, at least among the three countries that are involved in it. For Indian scholars, and I really don't deal directly with Pakistan because the Pakistan literature rarely even mentions Bengal. I should just say as well that when one thinks of partition and the imagery and Earth, Mira Nair's film or Sidwa's Ice Candy Man, actually talk about partition as if Bengal wasn't part of the engagement. Okay, so it's important to think through what it means to be elided in the discussions and how bringing it back might offer a different kind of window. There is little disagreement about the foundational character of the partition. For Indian scholars, particularly those revisiting partition in the wake of the 1984 Indian riots, it is viewed either as a metaphor of irreparable loss and dismemberment, and this is the kind of medicalization that Joya Chatterjee has introduced, or as one of the harsh realities of vivisection. Others emphasize how the partition shapes the everyday, or as Pandey suggests, very much our history, and unfortunately not the history of 1946 and 47 alone. Now, what I'm going to try to posit is that in Pandey's discussion, while he sees it as continuing, he sees it as continuing through its effects. Okay? So I want you to hold on to that idea through its effects. So similarly, Jasudhara Bagchi claims the partition has not yet ended. I mean that we still live in a continuous story of partition. In each of these reflections, it is the shared communal violence of 1946-47 and 1984 that calls the connection forward as people experience the effects of disruption and violence in other contexts. In other cases, the loss is expressed in split families living on different sides of the India-Pakistan border, or in the nonsensicality and absurdity of Sadat Hassan Mantu's so brilliantly describes in Tobak Texting. I'm assuming most of you know these short stories. I mean, if you don't, his writing is just splendid and very difficult to read, but splendid. For many scholars of Bangladesh, in contrast, the 47 partition is assumed to have made possible independence in 1971, thereby forcing a reading of 47 through the lens of an independent Bangladesh. Most others, however, privilege independence as simply mention partition in passing as a way to establish the coherence of a regional space and mark all the activities and actions, whether institutional, political, or social, which have followed in its wake. In 1998, I went and organized a small group of people to discuss the possibility of doing a collective project on 47. And they said to me, why the hell are you interested in 47? What we should be concerned about is 1971. Which is not to say one oughtn't be concerned about 1971 as well, but there was absolutely no interest in 1947. In almost all of these discussions, partition is assumed to be a discrete event that defines the independent states of India and Pakistan, serves to realize the separation of a Muslim Pakistan and a Hindu India, and confirms membership in a state system. Because remember, everything has to be sort of acknowledged through the global world economy. Characterized in this way, attention is drawn to the various expressions of partition, identifying its myriad consequences, or as in many examples from Bangladesh, specifying the presumed series of determinations that led to the event itself and to the eventual struggle for independence 24 years later. Recognizing partition as an event is evident in histories of partition that examine the communalization of the East Bengal countryside, and I can give you a host of names. Maybe I won't read this detail about the different writings in Bangladesh, but what's really quite clear is that it caused these things, okay? So it was an event, it had a parameter, it had effects in its wake, okay? In this talk, I wish to share an alternative rendering of the partition to unsettle its status as an event and share an interpretation that can reveal the ways in which nations and states and citizens and subjects are constituted through ongoing practices that work synergistically as a process and project of state formation. Now, when I use the word project, I actually am implying agentic capacity. So it's not just a process that unfolds that we can uncover, but in fact, if it's a project, it's a thought, imagined attempt to construct, to make history in a particular kind of way. Okay? So I think that's really going to be important when we try to think about, collectively, about what it means to think beyond the notion of partition happened in 1947. Okay? If it's a project, what does that entail? In this alternative rendering, the partition is a specific moment in a longer and larger project that constitutes the enactment of particular relations of rule and the instantiation of particular notions of belonging and exclusion. To engage these processes, and I don't know if many of you have read Phillip Abrams. Has anybody read Phillip Abrams here? I urge you to read him. He's a British historian, died unfortunately in the early 80s. But his argument is that there are two ways to see the state as an idea. And how many of you stop at a traffic light at 3 o'clock in the morning when nobody's on the street and it's a red light? How many go through it? Okay, so it was the idea of the state that operates to make us believe, even though we think we're so independent, free choice, liberated, we don't, buy into every little moral claim. But we all do, most of us do it, and all you have to do is do it once and get caught, and you'll do it forever after that. But the rule is invoked through a state that's an idea. There's nobody there watching you. Okay? It's kind of Foucauldian, but it's not quite the same thing. Okay, so what his argument is there's the idea of the state that operates to make us who we are as subjects of particular places with particular rule-binding moral claims. And there's government, which is what we think of as the state. Right? Except if we ask how government, if you tell me a ministry of X or a department of X operates, you don't think about that as the state. You think about it as institutions. But you don't operate in response to the particular meanings of, except with now with Homeland Security, it might be different, but by and large, we don't grow up thinking, oh, I have to do this because the Department of Health and Human Welfare says I should do it. Right? We do it for other moral claims. And this theoretical distinction is very helpful. Okay? That's all I'm going to say at the moment. I think it's more than helpful, but I think if you just imagine it as being useful for thinking about things in different ways, then I think you'd find the distinction between the state idea and the state as institution very important. So instead of reading this involved thing, if you think about partition as the claim or an edict that says, now we have two states, the Boundary Commission and our little friend says, Cyril Ratcliffe says, we're going to make a claim, here's the border and here's the boundary. Other people say maps are lies. What is a map? Where does a map come from? What interest does it serve? If you read anything on the Boundary Commission, you can see it being a very politically motivated regulation and rule, where the line exactly went, who made the last decision to say that this mango tree should be on this side and that mango tree should be on the other. If you look at the border, it seems just like that, actually. It's, it's not this little box that we said this would be a certain way, nor was it the Tanas or the districts or the areas that they said were a Muslim majority. Right? They cut across these spaces. So there was no administrative rationale for it. It was a political set of decisions. So there was a very recent article, and it says, as Wallach reminds us, all maps as schematic representations of space lie in one way or another. Okay? They lie in the sense that we don't know often where the border is. Right? And if we get beyond the notion of natural borders, the frontiers, and you can't go over them, we often don't know the people living in the frontiers. Right? Because the border ends up being made as a human activity that claims a particular kind of space. And it was made on the argument that there are primordial differences between Hindus and Muslims. Now, this is also central, okay? Academic attention addressing communal unrest, however, remained largely in the background of debate until the 1980s. In other words, the partition happened, a resolution was made, managerial problems, resettlement was an issue that both sides felt they had to work through to navigate the legitimacy of the border. But by and large, there was not much discussion, right? And there was very little discussion, even less discussion actually, on the Bengal side. Okay, so here when I'm talking about partition, I'm really referencing West Bengal and the Punjab. Okay, and what's important about that is that the issues emerged in response to ongoing violence that happens in violence that reemerges, I should say, in 1984 and 1992 with Ayodhya. All of a sudden, the literature just blossoms. It sounds like a funny word to use given we're thinking about violence, but the literature really explodes in response to those two events in particular that for some people, as the literature makes evident, is actually a re-experiencing of the violence that attended to the earlier period, either through memory, personal memory, or through collective memory, or through the memory that you pass through your next generation. So your children's memory of your retelling of your experience. There was also, of course, 50 years later, the independence, 50th anniversary of independence. This too forced a rethinking of 47. In other words, in 1997, there was lots of discussion about celebrating the 50th anniversary, despite the vivisection and dismemberment framings that had happened earlier. Okay. And so this led to a whole host of explorations, much of it inspired by two books early on. That's Ritu Menon and Kamala Bashin's book, and Urvashi Butalia's book. And for both of those collectivities, they use their own family connections, their own history and experience to actually access people who lived through the violence and who finally felt that they could talk about it. The only other space that was really full of insight were personal diaries, of which there were many and revealed much later and in the post-50th anniversary year. But it was clear that the ability to actually give voice to this experience was very, very difficult. Okay. Now again, Bengal is outside of this in many ways. The novels tended by and large to speak about families and villages in just the opposite way. In A River Churning, for example, there was an effort to talk about how villagers helped each other, that the syncretic assumption that Bengal sort of carries around it, as in terms of its identification, its syncretic tradition, really was expressed through these novels. Okay, so it's a very different sensibility, right? And that's not unimportant to recall, because it becomes a way to think through and reimagine what the partition actually meant. But how do we understand the sustaining of a certain kind of state formation, and how do we come to understand the building of a certain quality to a nationalist discourse? In other words, where does the discourse of Islamic State come from? Is it a creed? Is it a credo? Is it an edict? Can you make a claim about that? Or does something like an Islamic State, and I only use that as one kind of state, but for convenience, and it's convenient because precisely in 1971, the notion of not being Islamic enough becomes a justification for the Pakistan war with the East and West Pakistan independence. It's precisely that since you are not Muslim enough, there's a claim of the other vivisection now and the fear. Now, why is that important? I think what you'll find, and maybe I should just go to the case and then move back to some of the conceptual work I want to share with you. But I want to make a claim that the making of Pakistan as a Muslim state was a project. Right? It was separate from the fact that Muslim people may have dominated the population or the demographics of the area. Okay, now this is really a critical point. It doesn't sound like a big deal, but I think if you think through this case, you'll see what I mean. And let me read it. A lot of it's in the English of the case, so I didn't want to sort of not appreciate it. In 1971, during a criminal hearing, Sunil Kumar Daur, a Hindu, pled not guilty to the charge of passport violation before B.A. Siddiqui, representing the Superintendent and Remembrancer of Legal Affairs, Government of East Pakistan. The facts of the case are as followed, and this is a quote. The respondent, Daur, entered Pakistan on an Indian visa, which was validly visaed by the Deputy High Commission of Pakistan in Calcutta. Under the aforesaid visa, the respondent was entitled to visit Pakistan 8 times for a period of 2 months at a time within the period aforementioned. Having come into Pakistan, the respondent did not leave the country. Okay. His visa expired on 11 August 1954, but he continued to stay in East Pakistan without any valid documentation or permit issued on his behalf. On 8 January 1958, the respondent was arrested and prosecuted under Section 4 of the Pakistan Control of Entry Act 1952 for having violated the provision of subsection 6 of Section 3 of Act 50 of 1952. So the dates are really important. His visa expired in 1954. In his plea, Mr. Daur did not deny that he possessed an Indian passport or that he entered Pakistan on the passport that was properly visaed by the Pakistan Deputy High Commissioner's office in Calcutta. The basis of the charge against Mr. Daur is subsection 6 of Section 3 of Pakistan Control of Entry Act, which reads, "No Indian citizen having entered any part of Pakistan and being in possession of a valid passport duly visaed for partition shall remain therein after the expiry of the period of stay authorized in the visa, unless it is extended or renewed by authority to be specified in the rule made under the Act." Okay, so everyone agrees. He came in, he had a visa, he had a passport, an Indian passport. Interestingly, what became evident in this case is that the magistrate found that Mr. Daur was actually born in the territories that were included in Pakistan on 14 August 1947. So born in Pakistan, and was therefore a Pakistani by birth. Moreover, he noted that Mr. Daur's father was a Pakistani and had not at any point in time migrated to India. Complicating the prosecutor's case further, the magistrate found that Mr. Daur obtained his Indian passport only to facilitate his return to Pakistan, return home, after the introduction of the passport system. So what this signals is that he went before there was a passport system. He tries to come back, he said, it's not worth he said, one presumes that he said, it's not worth a hassle, I'll get a passport, I'll go to the Calcutta High Commission, I'll come back home, and I'll be with my father. He presumably expected that this was necessary since he was in India prior to the time when passports were first introduced, and for some time thereafter. Having left India in 1954, Daur returned there only when he was no longer considered a citizen of what one might call Greater India, that is, the Indo-Pakistan subcontinent before partition. Moreover, Daur returned to India only after applying for and receiving a Pakistani passport. Okay, from this, the magistrate concluded that Mr. Daur obtained the passport for the sole purpose of returning home when he was not a permanent resident in India. Thus, according to the magistrate, Mr. Daur was entitled to Pakistani citizenship by virtue of birth under Section 3A of the Pakistan Citizenship Act, which states that at the commencement of this act, every person shall be deemed to be a citizen of Pakistan if any of their parents or grandparents was born in the territory now included in Pakistan, and who after the 14th day of August 1947 has not been permanently resident in any other country outside Pakistan. Okay, so neither he nor his father was ever permanently registered, and his father was never in India to begin with, so this would cover him completely. Exploring the court proceedings, it is apparent that the discussion focused not on the complicated or perhaps even confused status of Mr. Daw, or whether birth, family lineage, or choice should or could help to adjudicate any misunderstanding of his legal status. Such a focus would suggest that the court address whether or not Mr. Daw had a rightful place in and the rights of protection and citizenship from Pakistan. Nor, interestingly, did the discussion address the labor landscape that included people who regularly migrated for temporary employment some distance from their home. Clearly, before partition, Dawes finding work in what would become West Bengal, or elsewhere, he does go to West Bengal, by the way, or elsewhere in India, would fit this common pattern of temporary labor migration, especially for those seeking non-agricultural employment that was surely more scarce in the eastern provinces than elsewhere. Instead, discussion focused on the legal status of the act, its timing, and Dawes' failure to comply with its strictures, requesting a proper and legal extension of his Pakistani visa. By this I mean that the court proceedings focused on subsection 6 of section 3 of the Act, which states that those holding a Pakistani visa shall not overstay in this country for the period mentioned in the visa without a permit for such a stay, or without the period mentioned in the visa being extended by Pakistani authorities. So the Pakistani authorities gave him a Pakistani passport. He never took the visa there, and they presumably didn't ask him if he had one. This was so despite the fact that the visa was only meaningful to cross the border and not face the harassment that returning migrants were facing at the time. And there was a lot of harassment during this period because the border was considered porous. There was not a huge security force at the time. So it was the whim of whoever harassed you or wanted to harass you at any given day. There was no sort of fixed plan about it. And I mean, I could tell you personal stories about, friends of mine who were there much earlier than I was, who were told when they were invited to dinner, oh, we're going to my auntie's house and she lives over there, and over there happened to be across the border, and it was very interesting to see how you negotiate that, because families didn't take the border in these early years in particular, and up through the early 60s very seriously. It wasn't monitored and so on at the time. Moreover, as Mr. Ismail, the advocate appearing for Daw argued, the Act cannot apply to a case where an Indian had entered Pakistan prior to 22nd August 1955 on an Indian passport properly visaed by the Pakistan government and had overstayed in Pakistan the period mentioned in the visa, even if the overstay is beyond the 22nd of August 1955. To complicate matters further, the status of Daw became a point of contention only after he already held a Pakistan passport. Accordingly, and in view of the fact that a Pakistani passport had been given to the respondent by the proper authorities on his application made in his behalf, it does not lie in the mouth of the state, which I think is a lovely way to think about a state as having life, right? In the mouth of the state today to say that the status of a Pakistani citizen has not been conferred on the respondent by the grant of the said passport. At least not until the passport had been canceled and the citizenship of Pakistan conferred upon the respondent has been withdrawn by government. So none of this happened. Okay, so why am I sharing this story with you? I mean, is it just curiosity? But Mr. Mirza, the advocate appearing for the state, nevertheless supported his argument for conviction on the basis of a similar case in the High Court of Hyderabad, Hyder Ali against the state of Hyderabad. In that Indian case, Hyder Ali, a West Pakistani, overstayed his visit to Hyderabad and was prosecuted. The learned magistrate, after examining 3 witnesses on behalf of the prosecution with no rebuttal in defense, proceeded in the simple logic that the respondent, having been proved to have overstayed beyond the duration of visit allowed by the permit, was liable to conviction under subsection blah, blah, blah. He sentenced him, as stated above, to a fine of rupees 200, or in default, to undergo simple imprisonment for 3 months, I'm sorry. Simple, I don't know what that means. That's why I think it's so great to read some of these cases.
Rigorous.
Yeah.
2 points. Simple.
And rigorous. So no forced labor. Like Daw, in other words, Ali had left Pakistan for India without a passport before a state law making this an offense had been put into place. On the basis of the Indian case and the evidence, Mr. Mirza rejected Mr. Ismail's request for acquittal. However, in view of the fact that Mr. Daw had obtained a Pakistani passport in due course of law, he set aside the acquittal of the lower court and found the respondent guilty of the offense of violating the provisions of subsection blah, 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 and sentenced him to a fine of rupees 250, which is not a small amount in 1954. Important to highlight here is Mr. Mirza's concluding statement. I would have passed a severer sentence in this case, but for the fact that the department concerned neglected in taking any action against an Indian citizen staying in Pakistan without valid documents for more than 3 years, and that he was prosecuted after having been given a Pakistani passport. Okay, so the language is really important, right? He was born in Pakistan, his father resided in Pakistan. By this magistrate, he was still considered an Indian citizen. Okay, why? How could an advocate for the state make this claim against someone born and raised in East Bengal, had family resident in East Pakistan during the time of his travels, and had secured a Pakistani passport on his return from India? Under such circumstances, how is one to define citizenship and understand the processes by which it is negotiated and upon whom it is conferred? What are the apparent rights of a Pakistani citizen being contested in this circumstance? These questions provide the empirical ground for interpreting state and nation-making in a field of power that is shaped by the decree of partition, the declaration of the independent state of Pakistan, but as argued earlier in the argument, which I didn't share with you yet, demands understanding partition as a social process of state-making and not defined merely by decree. Understood as a social process that is constitutionally and discursively formed, assumes that the verdict against Mr. Daw supports the claim that institutional practices are what marked and reproduced differences between Hindus and Muslims, despite Jinnah's claim that under Pakistani state, and here I quote, and everyone knows this, I'm sure, you may belong to any religion or caste or creed. That has nothing to do with the business of the state. We are starting with this fundamental principle that we are all citizens and equal citizens of the state. We should keep that in front of us as our ideal, and you will find that in the course of time, Hindus will cease to be Hindus and Muslims will cease to be Muslims, not in the religious sense, because that is of the personal faith of each individual, but in the political sense, as citizens of the state. Okay? So there was clearly a distinction made very early on. As Hamza Alavi would point out, there was a shift from Jinnah's Constituent Assembly inaugural speech, of which this was a part, where he is quite clear about citizenship and the subsequent realization that, and here I quote Alavi, it was not until 1952 that Jinnah's unworthy successors turned away from that ideal and began to exploit the worn-out rhetoric of religion to restore their failing political fortunes. They cried out that Islam was in danger. Coming from them, that was an insincere, bogus, and empty slogan when they had nothing positive to offer to the people. Our tottering leadership believing mistakenly that the slogan of Islam would be sufficient to silence any opposition. So now let me share with you briefly why this becomes important. It becomes important because in 1952, there's a language movement with an incredible massacre of university faculty in Bangladesh. It had started almost immediately after partition in the struggle to make Bengali the second national language. And it served the purpose mostly at that time of bringing together a kind of national claim about what was particular about being a Bengali Muslim as opposed to a Pakistani Muslim. Okay? This became very critical, but it also indicated a weakening of the ability to make a neat decree work, i.e. East and West Pakistan separated by 1,000 miles. Okay? So you have significant unrest and displeasure going on in East Pakistan at the time when this case comes to the fore. Not only is it important to think that this kind of reciprocity, if India can do it to us, we can do it to them, because remember, it was a single Pakistan at the time, but that's what political machinations give us a space to think with and to be critical of, right? So it's important not to lose sight of that. But the point is, the grounded arguments that were going on in East Pakistan at the time became the ground against which these kinds of claims of who really belongs. What's important in the state-making process is the ability to define who's a citizen and who is not, who should be excluded from the community and who should be included in the community. When you read a case like this, I don't want to make too much of the case, but it provides a window. I'm not sort of making a general kind of comment about every legal decision therefore does this, but I am suggesting that these kinds of engagements suggest how East Pakistan became thought of and constituted in and through an idiom of Islam. Precisely because it was Mr. Daw, and it wasn't Mr. Rahman that was involved in this case. And I could surmise, given reading other cases, that Daw's ethnicity and religion mattered in why he was excluded. Added to, of course, by the Indian case, added to by the insecurity that the Pakistani state, basically living in West Pakistan, felt threatened by the kinds of underground movements, and so anybody who could be claimed to be an outsider could be an outsider. Now, I think this is important because we think about, and I mentioned earlier, the notion of the logic of partition was primordial distinctions. Right? Hindus and Muslims can't live together. And then you have riots that continue, and this only adds legitimacy to that kind of sensibility. Okay? What I think cases like this suggest is that people are made Muslim or Hindu. They may be Muslim or Hindu, but they're made as citizen subjects to be defined through a religious idiom, which is a slightly different thing. And that's why I think keeping in mind Jinnah's distinction becomes very important. Under the state, you are a citizen. If you want to think about ethnic communities or religious communities, you can live your ethnicity, you could live your religion. But the distinction is really important. So how does a state become how does Islam become either a state religion, or how does a state become a religious state? And I'm suggesting that through these kinds of examples of the institutionalization of particular relations of exclusion, that you become defined that way, that you constitute the conditions that enable you then to make a claim about we're a religious state or we have a state religion. Okay? The specific thing about Bengal as well, which I didn't develop at the beginning, is that the kind of transference of populations happened over a very long time. There was no set of moments that you can say this was partition. We had these kinds of massacres at this time. We had a resettlement and a reallocation of legitimate movements, legitimate in inverted commas here, of course, and basically the movement stopped. Bengal border was much more porous. Yes, a significant proportion of the population left in 1947, but of those who stayed, they would leave at other crisis points, 1965, for example, but it was a much more fluid kind of space. This made a difference in these kinds of cases, particularly since labor migration, which is very difficult, by the way, to get any material on the labor migration. There's very little statistical available evidence about how large it was before, and maybe there was no need before to think about it because there was no, quote, national boundary. But even afterward, everything you read is always tied through the partition on the Bengal side, or at least on the East Pakistan, East Bengal, Bangladesh side. So it's a very interesting kind of thing to actually try to decipher. But my only claim here is that a nationalist project that the Pakistan state had was worked through the institutional apparatus of the state to make difference matter, if we want to hold on to Jinnah's claim. But the fact that Jinnah could make that claim suggests that there was a space for it to possibly be so. Okay, so what happens afterward becomes something that has to be constituted. So my point here is basically that this is not an effect of partition. This actually constitutes how the states of Pakistan and India get formed. These are actual practices of state formation, not simply, well, we had partition and now I have to do A, B, and C. Okay? So why I call it a project is precisely because this was an intended space for making decisions, making practices, and those consequences, both direct and indirect, become the product of these kinds of experiences. If you know, as a Hindu, that you will face this kind of critique or charge or insecurity, your own citizenship is made vulnerable, you live in response to that. If you think it's not made vulnerable, you live in response to that. If you feel secure and included and recognized, this notion of recognition as a citizen as opposed to a subject of the state, recalling Mamdani's distinction, it's really very important to think about this not simply as an effect of the partition. No doubt there are numerous effects of the partition. This is not to challenge that argument. It's only to put on the table that if we want to understand the development of the East Pakistan state, or the Pakistan state of which East Pakistan is a part, we have to understand it as a space of ongoing investments in making that state, reproducing that state. What Abrams said, I think, so poignantly is that he makes the claim that rule is a totalizing project, right? So if you're sitting in West Pakistan in 1954 and you want to rule, you try to think about all of the activities that you need to do to make the project realizable. But he makes the distinction by saying, but it's never a totalizing accomplishment because history is contingent. There are other things going on that make prediction, in the kind of sociological sense which I argue against, untenable. Nor do states exist and are ongoing endeavors. They are always being reproduced in some way. Right? If we think about the US state, the vulnerability we feel in 2001 and the ways in which responses to that vulnerability take various forms. Right? Just read Butler's very nice thing on precarity. She's very clear about saying that, yes, the war put together a sense of empowerment for people who felt at the moment most vulnerable because they were shocked at what happened in New York. Absolutely shocked is fine. The war was a particular intervention that responded in a particular way, in particular circumstances, to reconstitute a certain kind of state form. And we see what's happened in its wake. But it's not only that it's happened in its wake, it's reproduced a particular kind of state. Not coincidentally, but politically, i.e. with particular political intent, i.e. it's a project. It's not simply a process. I am not a person who thinks that we shouldn't think in processual terms. I precisely do think in processual terms. But that could be absent of agency, or absent of politics, or absent of power. What I think teasing apart the state formation aspect suggests is that we could actually trace back the conditions under which certain things are made possible. And they could be for good or evil. I'm not making a moral or a value judgment on what they are, but I am trying to just make the point that the Bangladesh example in this case provides us a window on seeing all states as social projects. Now that's slightly different than, we can tease apart, I think, the project of building nationalism and building a state. We can see it, in a host of different ways, but it's important to see them as, while they could be distinct, they can only operate synergistically. Okay, so the argument I'm making about state form, or state formation, is not to say it's not linked at all to nationalism, but it's to say that they can be teased apart in ways that can be productive for us to think about and think with. And that's basically the simple point of what I want to really talk about today. I have tons of detail. I could respond to any kinds of questions that you might have, and maybe I'll just leave it, at this. I don't know if I've talked too long or not long enough, but I could go on. I can tell you for sure I can go on. But I didn't want to make too many points to cloud the issue, but I think the important point that I'm trying to make, I hope, is clear, and that is that through the institutional apparatuses of the state, we can see the productive work it does to actually make the state in a particular way, in a particular fashion. And it's not coincidental. And the nationalist project of trying to build a national Islam, we can trace through by the very response that the Pakistani state made to this kind of claim. So it gives you both sides at the same time. Okay, and it's important to consider them in conversation, but not precisely the same thing. So you can't separate them, except analytically. But I think the analytic work of separating them helps us productively understand that partition is not a thing. It's not a thing that happened, it's not a decree. Even if it is a decree, we can't understand it simply as a decree, because it has to be reproduced over time. And its reproduction entails very particular kinds of work to realize it. Okay, and I'll just, I think, stop there and let's hear you guys.
I feel that one very important dimension has been left out, and that is the language. And Pakistan is a very classical example of how language works through the nationalism and even religion. What Pakistan was formed on the basis of religion could not sustain it just because of language. And while West Pakistan could accept Urdu as a national language, despite the fact that Urdu is not a
nationally
state
spoken
language anywhere, still that was supposed to be closer to Islam, the purer Islam, than the Bangladesh, which didn't accept Urdu.
Right.
So the Bengali language itself really that formed the core of the nationalism in Bangladesh. And so what I would suggest that not only the social project, it is a socio-linguistic project.
No, there was a whole section here, not to be defensive, but because the language movement was precisely what was so threatening to recognize Bengali as a national language. Yes. Was precisely what was so threatening to the Pakistani state.
Yes.
Right? Yes. So, and what I'm saying is this was going on precisely when they were trying to clean up any other kind of conflagration that might have happened. So it was, you're quite right, it was critical. But it in itself would not have been enough to unsettle things. It also gets realized through these other mechanisms. And there's lots of good, excellent work on the language movement, and you're 100% right. If I didn't make that clear, thank you for letting me know that. Yeah.
I have 3 quick questions, actually, and one, absolutely you're right on point about the linguistic identity. The first question is that you mentioned that the true state humans become, or in this case, for example, Hindus or Muslims. I was wondering if you could shed some light on the effect that the Bongo Pongo movement or the Partition of Bengal movement that happened in 1905 in the colonial regime, right? So it was already in the air, whereby the British asked for separation of Bengal on the basis of administrative and religious divisioning. So the state here, the modern, so to speak, state, the post-colonial state, was not the only agent of that kind of a division. So in that sense, is there a difference between this colonial subject making and a post-colonial citizen subject making because of this prior historical event that had its effect on the division of Bengal. The second point is about.
Just do one question at a time, because other people
Okay.
might have questions.
Okay.
I agree with you. I mean, I had to cut something on the language movement. I can't agree with you more. In other words, I think it's critical. But I must say, when I thought about cutting, as I'm sitting here in the process of cutting, I thought people would know that more than they would know about this case and what I'm trying to do with it. Okay, but it's against that language movement. I mean, it's an interesting question. You know, Pandi actually sort of argues that there are maybe periods, the pre-colonial, the colonial, and the post-colonial, but the experience of the national project is not that distinctive, that the violences associated with the national project are not that distinctive. I mean, because his idiom is really very much about violence. But I think what's pretty clear also is the difference between a mandate from the British and the ways in which, over the long term, a national state, and I'll do it that way despite my criticism of maps, a national state that's bounded in a particular kind of territory raises different kinds of expectations for its subjects who may be citizens. Okay? So I think the distinctions are important analytically. I don't know if the character of the analysis would need to be different because we're differing temporally. In other words, does temporality trump the analytic lens, or does temporality provide a contingency that needs to be taken into account so that by 1911 somebody could claim that it's over? Right? That we're going to again rethink the partition. Right? So 1905 becomes a consequence of a British intervention. Right? And so I think those are different in terms of what set of expectations of citizens and subjects can demand of a state which they claim is theirs. Think about it. I mean, the best example I have is watching in 1994, the first time black people were able to vote in South Africa. And I remember seeing a woman literally carried in a gurney. Okay? Now, what does that say about having a post-colonial state? I mean, I think it says a whole lot. I can't tell you what it says particularly now, but I think it's quite different than the removal of any kind of presumption of power among people who don't have access, especially in East Bengal. Okay, and but the other question we might want to think about collectively is this question of language, because there was a move for an undivided Bengal. Okay, other contingencies came in its place. So I don't want to put everything. I mean, I think it's central, but it's not independent of a whole host of other things. I mean, and Joya Chatterjee makes this clear about, who was on which side of the border in terms of, here's East Bengal. Why should it be willing to lose every factory that refines its jute, every mill that refines its cotton? I mean, all of that is done on the other side. So language didn't trump there, didn't have the same potency. So yes, language is important, but I wouldn't want to put all my eggs in the language basket. It's actually not sufficient.
I have a question. Then you can use it.
I figured.
It's really curious, and I'm really glad that you presented this stuff, because it's making me think about the concept of state. I mean, your ability to look at how state is formed and processed is something that we are looking at the beginning of the Indus civilization, the Mauryan state, the later historical states. And I'm just wondering if this kind of, I'm sure that the process is going on, and I'm just trying to figure out how early this kind of process could be traced in history to understand, because this would be a modern state and the way that modern states are formed. So when does this kind of process really crystallize historically, and if you had a chance to look at that? Because I'm not sure that the Mauryan state was established this way, but it may have been.
Yeah.
It might be something to look for historically.
I mean, I would say in response that I think it would be fascinating to see, but I would want, if it was me doing the answering, to actually not use the lens of the modern state. I mean, in other words, instead, the lens of the modern state works in this case. But I am hesitant to think that states are states are states, or systems of rule are systems of rule are systems of rule. I think systems of rule take a particular state form when we already have a constituted state system in which that works. I would probably look at systems of rule as opposed to states, nominally shared but distinctive, because I would surmise that the processes and the practices that would enable it would be very different. But my own, I mean, I've worked on state formation for years, and it's precisely because I find it so subtle, but I also find it very historically specific. So, if I was invited to think about, reading some stuff on a totally prior period that had no conception of an institutional apparatus that we know, and recognition, because recognition is really important. I mean, we knew after every independent struggle, the next 24 hours is who's going to call up and say, we recognize you as an independent country. I mean, that's critical. And you can't think outside that box, and that's not what's happening, in earlier states. So the notion of state is very different.
But we just don't know. We don't have a literary record of it. So.
Yeah, but we surely have notions of rule.
Yeah.
And that may be a more fertile way to interrogate. It's like my critique, and again, it's in this paper, is that I cannot, or I find it very difficult, I should say, to get a Bangladeshi to talk about 47 without talking about 71. I mean, I've read how many books on the 50s, and even 47, and the last chapter, 3 pages, conclusion, is about Bangladesh. I mean, and scholars who are quite reputable and who I admire in so many ways will just hop from 50 to 71, as if nothing happened in between. So it's really curious. I mean, why I'm looking at the 50s myself is precisely to sort of unpack some of this and find out what it is that didn't happen in East Bengal. Now, what didn't happen in East Bengal is that they had 0 to start with. They literally had no tables, no chairs, no typewriter, and no legal volumes of legal text to actually institute a court of law. I mean, you read the archives of the late 40s and 50s. They literally were writing notes on, in pencil and in pen, saying, "Please, can you send? I know you have 2 sets of X journals. Can you please send them to us because we need them?" So, all of that makes a difference. Nonetheless, I still think that there are these institutions that actually get structured in a way, often mirroring, I mean, to go back to your other question about this periodization, this temporality, there's no doubt that, English law features in all of this. We can't take that away. But it's how does it feature, and how does it feature differently in different places is what I would sort of respond to. But you had another question.
Okay, this is about, because we are talking about the formal institutional apparatus of the state here, documentation, etc. I was just thinking in terms of, so not only state making, but the citizenship making, for example. So here we see 3 kinds of relationships. One is India-Bangladesh relationship, one is Indo, and I'm speaking from the perspective of India here, Indo-Bangladesh relationship, Indo-East Pakistan relationship, and an East Pakistan and Bangladesh relationship. They have 3 very distinct kinds of relationships.
Absolutely.
And so what I would like to know is that because your talk primarily talks about the Hindu-Muslim, the religious identity, and therefore I was trying to bring in the linguistic, and linguistic is not the linguistic, but the linguistic cultural identity of Bangladesh and West Bengal, right? So for example, even now, in West Bengal, we celebrate Bhasha Divas, right? So the language day, correct? Right. In 22nd January. We still talk in terms of East Bengal Mohammedan and Mohun Bagan football clubs. We still talk in terms of the food, whether you're from East Bengali food or West Bengali food, right? Music, culture. What this kind of an ethnic, linguistic, cultural identity, do you see a difference between this kind of an identity operating in a similar way, for example, with respect to Pakistan and North Indian?
I don't know enough about Punjab.
Okay.
That's a whole different, thing. But I would say, going back to the fourth, you gave me three. The fourth one is Bangladesh in 1971 to 75,
Right.
and West Bengal, and 1975 to probably 1996. Okay? Because I think the sense of the Awami League and the old Muslim League had a very different relationship to West Bengal than the military regimes
The Ershad
and Khaleda
regime,
Zia.
you mean?
Huh?
The Ershad regime?
Ershad, Zia Rahman.
Okay.
So, I mean, once Zia comes, it's very clear that he's pretty harsh on India, wants nothing to do with it, and in fact, he runs off to the Middle East. So it's really in the Bangladesh period that the distinctions are equally important. Now, the other question that's important to think about is the power dynamics between West and East Bengal, or Bangladesh and West Pakistan. And, I remember talking to people who came back from the first time, which was about 8 years ago, that the book fair, they invited, Sheikh Hasina came, and, but if you talk to the authors, they were put upon for being Bengal.
Yes.
Okay, so it's not simply, we share this nice religion, this nice language, and, we have cultural things, and, we're both, in a certain sense, rather cosmopolitan in the way in which we deal with religion, and so we're really alike. And yet, that divide is very clear.
As in,
If you say Lobon for salt, we know where you come from. If you say Pani for water, we know where you come from. I mean, it's very clear. And it matters. Now, I don't know if it mattered differently in 47 had I had an occasion to interview people who went across the border, and if it matters now, what kind of assimilationist processes are going on that makes it much more a collective. It doesn't, and not across the border now, I'm just talking about all the East Bengals who are in Cal. How many would make an argument that our linguistic traditions have brought us together?
is it also about class, though?
Absolutely. Oh,
Bengal,
absolutely.
At least in West Bengal.
Every
when-
place.
So all the so-called poorer people most of the poorer people would be Muslims coming from Murshidabad area and all those areas. And they would, it's very common for them to talk in terms of Pani and the use of Urdu words, right? So it's not just that East Bengal division, but also the class difference, which is correlated to religion here.
But if you talk to Dipesh, for example, I don't know what class you want to put him in, but he's surely, exactly, okay, so, he senses a difference. He will say he senses a difference. He's a Bengal. So, yes, class does feature in all of this, but all of this requires really grounded research. We can pontificate a lot about these things, and one loves to do that. But in the end, so many of these questions have remained unanswered because we don't have, enough people going out and looking at some of these questions. So I think, I was just trying to provoke you to be curious about Bangladesh and to think that even when you take words that we take for granted, like state, because states only work because you stop at the red light, right? They wouldn't work if you didn't stop at the red light. They wouldn't work if enough fear that you would get caught in this or that activity, would be a threat. So states do act in ways that we reproduce. We tell our kids, don't cross at the cross at the green, wait for the red light. All of this gets reproduced, and it's that reproduction that actually becomes the formation of a national culture, of the formation of a state. I remember the first time I was in Copenhagen, and it was the walking street, and everyone was out. It was a beautiful day, and there was no cars coming. I walked across the street, and this gentleman put his hand up like this, and he said, "Madam, in our society, this would be a very bad example for our children." And I said, "Sir, I'm very, very sorry. In New York City, it's different." But the point is, I didn't know the rules. If you stand on the street corner when there's no cars coming in New York City, people would think you're a tourist. right? Okay, so those cultural norms that we take in our everyday are also the norms that operate, that make us functional as a collectivity. And so I think we don't tend to sort of transpose the sense of, not crossing at a red light and other forms of normative regulation that are essential to make the social formation function without being functionalist. Anyway, thank you all for coming and for your questions.